Today on Education Forum, an interview with Dr. Gary Sprayberry, Associate Professor and Chair of History and Geography here at Columbus State University. From the studio, high atop Jordan Hall in the College of Education and Health Professions at Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia, this is Education Forum with your hosts Jeff Conklin and Greg Blaylock. Hi, welcome to Education Forum. I'm Jeff Conklin, here with my co-host, Dr. Greg Blaylock. Today's guest is someone who we haven't had on the show before, but he's well known on campus and he does things in the community, and we thought he'd be an interesting guest to have on Education Forum today. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Gary Sprayberry, who's Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History and Geography.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
At Columbus State University.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Now, I thought we'd start out a little bit, talk about your background. So where are you from?
I'm from outside of Anniston, Alabama, which we're going to be talking about in a couple of minutes.
That fits very well.
Yeah, and I grew up there, and I did my undergraduate work at Jacksonville State University in North Alabama, and I did my graduate work at the University of Alabama. I got my PhD there in history.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, how long have you been here at Columbus State?
I got here in the fall of 2006. I was hired here to teach African American history and modern American history, really post-1945 American history.
Okay, okay.
And so what's your major focus?
The Civil Rights Movement, and also the Vietnam War era and student radicalism, too, in the 1960s, the rise and fall of the New Left.
Excellent.
So there's a direct connection to some of the work that you're doing right now in terms of the Freedom Riders.
Oh, definitely.
Oh,
yes,
gosh,
definitely.
Strong connection.
Yes.
So you have an event coming up here on campus today.
Yeah.
And what is that event?
Well, the History and Geography Department, in partnership with the Carson McCullers Center for Writers and Musicians, we're doing a year-long commemoration of the American Civil Rights Movement. And this will include lectures by activists and scholars. There's going to be a film series in the spring. We're doing various field trips to historical sites, and then also part of this will be the opening of the Freedom Riders exhibit over in the Schwell Memorial Library.
Okay. And today you have a speaker.
Yes. We're very excited.
Okay.
Charles Person was one of the original 13 Freedom Riders. He's from Atlanta, and he's going to be here today, 12:30 in University Hall, giving an address, talking about his experiences with the Freedom Rides and in the Civil Rights Movement.
He was one of the youngest Freedom.
Yeah, he was 18 years old. He was a freshman at Morehouse College when he took part in the Freedom Rides.
Now, when were the Freedom Rides?
They started in May 1961. And they lasted until November 1961. And it involved more than 400 activists who boarded buses in Washington, D.C., drove through the Upper South, the Deep South, and their intentions were to end up in New Orleans because they were testing and challenging segregated facilities along interstate routes. And they eventually succeeded in doing so. The federal government got involved and did desegregate these facilities.
Now at the time, from the federal perspective, many of these interstate routes should have been legally desegregated.
Right.
However, the federal government, as I understand it, didn't really enforce it. Didn't come in to enforce it from a local perspective.
Yeah, there was a Supreme Court decision in 1960, Boynton versus Virginia, that ordered the desegregation of these public facilities along interstate routes. Bus stations, the waiting rooms, lunch counters, bathrooms within bus stations as well, and the buses themselves too. But yeah, they weren't enforced. And that was one reason why the Congress of Racial Equality wanted to do the Freedom Rides. They thought it would challenge local authorities to enforce the Supreme Court ruling. They wanted to test to make sure they were abiding by the Supreme Court's decision. And James Farmer, who was the director of the Congress of Racial Equality, our core, said, we're going to let the bigots in the South do our job for us. We're going to go into these facilities. If the police are enforcing the Supreme Court decision, fine. If we're attacked, fine, maybe then it'll force the federal government to come in and enforce this ruling and protect us.
Now, do you think, of course, and we can talk a little bit in a few minutes, I'm sure you've got some stories to tell with regard to what the Freedom Riders went through, but I've always been curious, do you think the Freedom Riders Corps as an organization, when they embarked on this, do you think they understood the kind of violence that they would see along the ride? Do you think they foresaw it being as bad as it was?
I think a lot of them did. John Lewis, who's now a congressman from Georgia, the night before the Freedom Rides left Washington, D.C., the first week of May 1961, he said, and he still says, that we all consider this the Last Supper. You know, we thought we were going into the jaws of the lion. We thought we had already made that decision and had come to the realization that we could be killed in these rides, and yet they still continued to do so.
And they weren't far off.
Yeah.
They were right on.
Oh, right. Exactly right.
Yeah. They knew what they were. So how did they travel? They traveled by bus.
Yeah. They, and I'll talk about the first original group. There were 13 original Freedom Riders.
Okay.
It was a biracial group, and they traveled in 2 commercial buses. There was a Greyhound and a Trailways bus.
Okay.
And they left Washington, D.C., like I said, the first week of May, and they were going to travel through the Carolinas, through Virginia, Carolinas, and then through the Deep South and end up in New Orleans. And they were aboard the buses with regular passengers who had no idea there was a protest going on in their midst.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Because so they were right involved in these the attacks that would eventually happen. So yeah.
So now, the attack started early in the trip. So did they start up in Virginia, or?
They started in the first week of May, and nothing really happened. There were minor incidents in Virginia and the Carolinas. John Lewis, for instance, was involved in a scuffle and with police involvement in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And then they got to Atlanta, but nothing had really happened to them. In fact, people were writing in their journals and sending letters back to their families saying, "Has the South changed?"
This isn't that bad.
I mean, one person even said, Francis Bergman even commented that the world seems to be all sweetness and light, that the South is changing. Now, little did they know that the Klan in Alabama had planned an ambush. And the Klan in the Carolinas and Virginia didn't attack the buses because they were ready for, they were going to allow the Alabama Klan to do their dirty work. Everyone knew about the Freedom Rides. The FBI knew about the Freedom Rides. The local police knew about the Freedom Rides. The Greyhound and Trailways knew about the Freedom Rides. But no one did anything to prevent the violence.
So the police really weren't following the law as they went along?
No, they weren't.
In fact,
they
as
were
I
a party
understand, they
to
colluded
it.
with,
they did.
in parts of Alabama and perhaps other states, colluded with Klan members and other organizations.
Bull Connor, who was infamous Bull Connor, was the police commissioner of Birmingham, and he actually worked out a deal with the Klan and these neo-Nazi organizations in Birmingham. He said that when the bus gets here, full of Freedom Riders, we're going to give you guys 15 minutes to do your worst to the riders before I send my boys in to stop the violence. Now, the same thing happened in Anniston as well. According to the FBI files, there was a Klansman named Kenneth Adams who an hour before the bus arrived was seen going into the police station in Anniston. And so I think there was some kind of arrangement made with the police department there, because the police department was 3 blocks away from the Greyhound station in Anniston, and it took them 30 minutes to get to the spot.
And that's where they burned the bus.
Right. Well, the bus pulls in around this interesting story because they leave Atlanta early Mother's Day, 1961, and they're going to head to Anniston and then go to Birmingham, Montgomery, and then eventually reach New Orleans. That morning they leave, and they right before they entered the city of Anniston, they see another Greyhound bus leaving Anniston, and that Greyhound bus flashes its lights, and they pull over on the side of the road. The bus driver from the bus that had just left Anniston boards the bus that's entering Anniston with the Freedom Riders and warns them. They say, "They're gathered in the streets waiting for you. You might want to take another route." And the bus driver says, "Well, I got passengers I have to let out." So they continued onward, and sure enough, there were Klansmen there in the streets waiting for them. They didn't have their robes on; they had just come from church, so they were there in their Sunday best.
You bet. Okay.
Dozens of them waiting in the streets. Perhaps it's
enough.
yes,
Yeah.
waiting for them. Maybe 150, 200 people were waiting for them. The bus pulls into the Greyhound station. The Klan immediately surrounds the bus. And they start rocking the bus back and forth. They smash a window. Somebody takes a switchblade out, slashes one of the tires.
Now, it wasn't just Freedom Riders on the bus at that time.
It was
so it's just people that happened to be taking a ride.
Yeah, passengers who were going to see their mother on Mother's Day. And they were involved in this protest. Eventually, the police do arrive on the scene.
30 minutes later.
30 minutes later, the bus is allowed to leave the Greyhound station, and about 6 miles outside of Anniston, because when they left, the Klansmen all went to their cars and followed the bus as it left Anniston. The police department followed for a while until they reached the limits of police jurisdiction. They turned around. So the bus is out there on its own. 6 miles outside of Anniston with 50 cars full of Klan members behind them. The flat tire on the bus goes,
tire finally goes.
It goes flat.
Okay.
The bus has to pull over in front of a grocery store, Forsyth's Grocery. And the Klan again surrounds the bus. And the bus driver gets off frantically trying to find a tire. But this is 1961, Alabama on a Sunday.
Yeah,
It's a little tough
to
get a tire. Yeah. So the bus is surrounded, and it's interesting. There was a man named L. Cowlings, who was an undercover police officer, state police officer for Alabama. Now, the governor, John Patterson, actually, who has connections to Phoenix City, of course, John Patterson actually ordered L. Cowlings to get on the bus undercover in Atlanta. Now, what he wanted L. Cowlings to do was observe the riders and make sure they weren't killed as well.
Sure.
So he was there. Now, his actions prevented the riders from being killed, because as the bus is sitting alongside the road, 6 miles outside of Anniston, with the Klan surrounding it, and these are wild stories. There was one Klan member who ran around the bus with a club, saying, "We have many more clubs just like this." There were people who were running up to the windows and shrieking and shouting at the rioters. It was a pretty volatile situation. But L. Cowlings and the bus driver had concluded that the best thing we can do is everyone stay on the bus, don't get off. We won't let anybody board the bus.
Sure.
And we'll just have to wait for a tire to get, or the police to get here. And so for, minute after agonizing minute, for about a half hour, there's a stalemate. Eventually, a guy named Cecil Llewellyn, his nickname was Goober, someone testified later, told the FBI that they saw him approach the back of the bus with what looked like a bundle of rags. Okay. And he smashes out the back window and tosses this in. It turns out to be some kind of incendiary device. And they said it sounded like a can of beer opening. And suddenly the bus starts filling with smoke. And people are panicking. People are jumping out of the windows.
Can't stay on.
They're rushing toward the front. And L. Cowlings and the Klan members. In fact, there's a man named Jerry Eason who runs an insurance company in Anniston today, who was one of the Klan members, who worked at a flower shop. He was 18 years old at the time. He and another man tried to hold the door shut so they would burn up inside. L. Cowlings, the undercover police officer, brandished his pistol and ordered the Klan members to step away from the door so the riders were able to barrel out.
Sure.
Hank Thomas, one of the riders, was severely beaten with a chain when he came out. But the riders made it out, and the regular passengers made it off the bus. No one was killed.
Now, at that time, how many Freedom Riders were on the bus? Was it still the 13, or was it more?
They were divided in two buses. This Greyhound bus had, I think, six or seven. There were 6 on one, 7 on another bus. And then the other Trailways bus had no idea what had happened to the Greyhound bus. They arrive in Anniston an hour later at the Trailway station, and they are informed what had happened. And the Klan members boarded the bus at the Trailway station, and there was a scuffle aboard. Charles Person, who's going to be here today talking on CSU campus, was one of the people beaten. Another man, Walter Bergman, who was a professor from, I think, University of Michigan, he was beaten as well and suffered brain damage for the rest of his life. So there was some violence aboard the bus in Anniston at the Trailway station, but eventually that bus is able to leave Anniston and it drives to the Birmingham Trailway station, where Bull Connor had made an arrangement with the police to stay away for 15 minutes, and of course they were attacked there.
Of course,
and beaten severely.
Okay, now when you talk about the 400 plus Freedom Riders, they weren't all African Americans.
No, there were 236 of them were African Americans. 200 of them were white participants in these protests.
And
so
that
it was a biracial group. Yeah.
And that was a big part of it, though.
Yeah.
Is that you were having support from...
Definitely.
And from what I understand, in many instances, some of the white participants took the worst of some of the beatings.
Yes.
I don't know if that's true, but that's that's what I understand.
Yeah.
Sort of as an example of what happens to you if you help out.
Yeah.
In these types of causes.
James Peck, who was one of the older participants and wrote a interesting book called Freedom Ride afterwards. He was one of the people. He was a white man. He was beaten pretty severely in Anniston and in Birmingham. Okay. And there are some famous photographs of him with blood and stitches and bandages on his face.
Now, where did these folks come from?
All over. Okay. They were Charles Person was from Atlanta. John Lewis was from Alabama. There were people from Michigan. There were people from the Northeast. They were from all over the country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did it stop then after Birmingham?
No, these two rides stopped because they had been.
They burned up the bus.
They burned up the bus.
Yeah.
They suffered from smoke inhalation. They'd been battered and bruised.
Oh,
yeah. And in fact, the Freedom Riders in Anniston, the Anniston Memorial Hospital refused to treat them because the reason is because they were afraid the Klan would bomb the hospital, and the Klan threatened to blow up the hospital there in Anniston.
And they could easily have done it after doing the bus.
Oh yeah,
so,
definitely.
Yeah,
And they arrived at the hospital. They surrounded the hospital, surrounded the exits, and so the hospital administrators thought it was best that they leave. So Fred Shuttlesworth, who was a civil rights leader in Birmingham, who's responsible for the Birmingham campaign of '63. He and others drove to Anniston and picked the riders up and brought them back to Birmingham, where they were taken to people's homes and to churches. So that first Freedom Ride ended. Same thing happened in Birmingham. People they didn't want to continue. They were badly beaten.
Oh, yeah.
So they were given medical treatment. Now what's interesting is Diane Nash, who was a student at Fisk University. She heard that the first two Freedom Rides had been stopped, had ended in violence. She and some students from Fisk drove to Birmingham to continue the rides. They were going to buy tickets and continue.
Okay.
Bull Connor had them all arrested when they appear in Birmingham, drove them to the Alabama-Tennessee line, put them out of the cars, and then they drove back to Birmingham. Diane Nash, rather than go back to Nashville, hitched a ride back to Birmingham and continued the ride. Now, the problem here was that John Patterson, who was governor of Alabama at the time, who publicly went on television and called the riders agitators and nitwits, basically said, we hate what happened, but they pretty much got what they deserved.
Sure, they shouldn't come down here and cause us trouble.
That's it.
Yeah,
outside agitators.
Of course. Of course.
And so he refused to provide protection for them. Robert Kennedy, who was Attorney General at the time, he and John Patterson exchanged some very nasty phone calls with one another. And you have to remember, too, that John Patterson was a supporter of Kennedy in the 1960 election, both Democrats.
Sure.
And so finally, Kennedy gets John Patterson to agree to provide protection for the riders so they could continue from Birmingham to Montgomery. And sure enough, they do provide protection. There are police cars, motorcycles, there's a helicopter. But by the time that bus had reached Montgomery on May 20th, a week after, the Saturday after the Mother's Day attack, the cars had gone, the motorcycle
just kind of
faded
away, huh? Yeah.
The helicopter had disappeared, and when they arrived at the Trailway station in Montgomery, they were attacked by hundreds of people
with no protection. Again.
Right. John Lewis was among the people who were beaten severely, and it was disgraceful. The riders were then taken to a church. It was Ralph Abernathy's church in Montgomery. And the Klan actually surrounded that church because they had a large gathering there of many people from the community. Martin Luther King was there, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and these riders were all in this church. and it was surrounded by the Klan, and they were started flipping cars outside, burning some of them, threatening to destroy the church. So the Kennedys, and you have to remember about Kennedy too, that he was a reluctant civil rights activist.
Very much so, yes.
He was all about foreign affairs. So for him, civil rights was, I would even guess that it was a nuisance for him. He was always concerned with the foreign affairs. He was always concerned. He was a Cold Warrior through and through. And of course, the Bay of Pigs had just happened a month before this. So he was always focused. Oh, he's got a lot on his plate, and so he's worried about foreign affairs. So he sees that this is a volatile situation in Montgomery. I must do something now. So he ordered hundreds of federal marshals to go in and protect the rioters and defend the church. And John Patterson, the governor, actually declares martial law in Montgomery that night.
Of course.
And National Guard comes in. But the thing is, the rides continue. People continue to step up, volunteer, walk into the Lion's Den, and hundreds would continue the rides throughout the summer and into the fall of 1961.
Which is amazing. Tell me this. Now, of course, horrendous beatings took place. Was anybody killed as a result of any of this?
No, and people were...
which is astounding.
It is astounding.
Which is astounding.
Yeah.
And that's what I was wondering. How is it that at that time, during this time of volatility, while these things are going on, that lynchings just didn't spontaneously occur, or just other horrific...
Lynchings had certainly trailed off by the 50s and 60s, although there were still some famous ones, Emmett Till in 1955. I think the reason no one was killed in the Freedom Rides was because Alabama did provide protection for the rioters as they motored through Alabama. When they got to Mississippi, rather than, now there was violence, of course.
I'm sure.
But what they did, once they got to Jackson, they were arrested and they were carted off to Parchment State Penitentiary in North Mississippi. They were abused, tormented, mistreated. Give you one example: Stokely Carmichael, who becomes the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and probably one of the younger, more radical members of the Civil Rights Movement, becomes a critic of King over time as well, Martin Luther King. He's one of the Freedom Riders. He gets arrested. He gets put in a jail cell in Parchment State Penitentiary. He is stripped of his clothes, so he has nothing on but his boxers. He has no blankets. They take the mattress off of his bed. They bring in an industrial fan outside of his cell and blast cold air into the cell 24/7. And how does he respond? He and others start singing songs of delivery and freedom the whole time. They're eventually released, of course, but they spend sometimes weeks, sometimes months inside
before
the
they ever
prison.
go to court, too.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story.
It is a fascinating story. I think it's going to be a great talk today. Now, what other events do you have planned that go along with this?
Yeah.
You were saying that there's going to be an exhibit.
There is an exhibit, and the Freedom Riders exhibit is co-sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and of course PBS's American Experience series. They've sponsored this, and we are also getting sponsorship from the Faculty Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. Courtney George, who's the director of the McCullers Center, and I won a grant to fund a lot of these activities. And so the exhibit, which includes photographs, oral remembrances, some primary source documents, things of that nature. It's just several panels. It's a very nice exhibit. So that'll be here till from October 17th till November 7th. The exhibit will be in the Schwab Memorial Library. We have other events too. We've already
brown bag.
We have brown bag lectures. I'm giving one downtown at 12:30 on October 31st. And one Arsenal Place at the Yancey Center, downtown campus. And I'm going to be talking about what I just talked about, the Freedom Rides in Anniston and Birmingham. And also, too, we're having a couple of lectures. An author by the name of T.K. Thorne, who's just written a book about the investigation of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, is going to be here. She's a former police captain from Birmingham. So she's going to be here on October 24th at 12:30 in Schwab Memorial Library, talking about her book and the investigation of the church bombing. On November 7th, Thomas Aiello, who's a history professor at Valdosta State, is going to be here at the library talking about, and it's at 12:30 again, He's going to be talking about the Atlanta Hawks and the integration of the Atlanta Hawks basketball team, and really about race in Atlanta, how people reacted to the Hawks moving to Atlanta, having these African American basketball players.
Oh, really?
And
Yeah.
Thomas Ayala is a very interesting guy, and I've met him at a couple of conferences, and that's why I wanted him to come.
Oh,
because
sure.
He's great. Yeah.
Now, why are you doing this now? Is it an anniversary of something?
Yes, we thought that, I mean, there was recently the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington.
Okay.
Where we have the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
So we thought it was the perfect time to commemorate these events, and most importantly, pay tribute to the many individuals who were involved in the Civil Rights Revolution, people like Charles Person.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Well, I'm going to have to stop you right here.
Okay.
Because I think we've run out of time.
Okay.
And I know you've got other events you got to go to.
Yeah,
You have someone to pick up today.
Yeah.
So we'd like to have you back.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
been a great,
Anytime.
wonderful.
It's great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Gary Sprayberry, and I'd also like to thank you for watching Education